That's great. And welcome to Democracy Nerd. This is the end of December. It's just before, just a little less than a year before President Biden's anniversary, single year being in office. As always, we end the first year, or maybe, I don't know, since the last 20, 30 years, we end the first year of a presidency, taking account not only of what has happened, but what has not happened. Months-long haggling over the social spending plan. We'll get an update on that. It may be all but over. There was an infrastructure bill that was talked about by the previous president for years and years. Did happen under this president. And maybe the best way for the minority party to win in 2022 is not to run on a program, but just to run against Democrats. We'll talk about that and more. With us right now is Amanda Marcotte of Salon. Thank you so much for joining us, Amanda.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So now as we look back on the past year, to you, what was the thing that surprised you the most about federal politics and governmental policy happenings or non-happenings?
I think if you were going to tell me a year ago where we'd be now, what would surprise me the most is how aggressive Biden really was about trying to pass a major progressive agenda. I would have never, ever guessed that, if I'm being honest. I think that he ran, I think a lot of people forget that in the Democratic primary, he kind of ran to be the more kind of conservative candidate and kind of won because a lot of Democratic primary voters thought that that was a way to play it safe and win the election. But then he went into office clearly with an eye towards, I think, the kind of savvy mainstream media take would be like trying to placate the progressives, but I don't think that's actually what his goal was. I think he really came into office with a plan to pass bold progressive economic legislation because he sincerely and I think correctly believed that it was the kind of thing that would reinvigorate this country. And I'm a little less in agreement that it was going to be the sort of thing that would sort of save our democracy. But I appreciated his kind of point of view of it, that his argument was that if we can prove that government works, then people will stop sliding down the hill to fascism, right?
So I want to pick up on the first thing you said, and you can push back on me. I had a different read than the conventional wisdom, or than most of the punditry that I've consumed, that said, oh, he ran as kind of this moderate conservative guy, and now he's trying to placate some Elizabeth Warren voters. I viewed that he ran as a Democrat, and that his definition of Democrat has been not static throughout his career, except for he has tended to follow, roughly speaking, the median of Democrats in power. And that's kind of the prediction. And so as the Democratic Party goes, so goes Joe Biden and a handful of other politicians that he hasn't tried to lean to be either the Joe Lieberman or the Bernie Sanders, but instead just be kind of not the center of the political spectrum, but kind of the center of the Democratic Party. Tell me the ways that I am wrong, and one way might be policy proposals that he pushed during or pushed against during the campaign that demonstrated sort of a shift now that might disprove my impression.
I wouldn't disagree that he's always tried to place himself at the center of the party, but weirdly, like the one exception to that rule was on a lot of financial and economic policy, which is he was very much to the right of the Democratic Party in the 90s, in the early 2000s. He was one of the most prominent defenders and proponents of I think it now is the 2006, I want to say, maybe 2004 bankruptcy bill that George W. Bush signed.
Just typed down, yep.
Yeah, he was the guy that was behind that. Bill Clinton pocket vetoed it in 99 against Biden's wishes at the request of Elizabeth Warren, actually. So that was a long time ago. And then he revived it under Bush because it was such a big deal to him and sort of the banking industry that backed him in Delaware. So
So
I
this
think
is
it
so,
wasn't unreasonable
no,
to be
that's
a
no,
little
that's an
more.
excellent, point. And so I'm now gonna morph my impression with with additional speckle of fact. It's still my view that he aims to be traditionally aimed to be, is generally aimed to be sort of the center Democratic Party and friends of a set of lobbyists that I don't have a perfect list of, right? But that he is a denizen of Washington D.C., a denizen of his district, and so when it comes to like he would pass some FDR policy, but if he also had a chance in terms of like spending a bunch of government money, he'd be down to spend a bunch of government money, but he might not want to tick off some sector of lobby buddies that he's worked with for some number of decades. That would be my caveat to the thing I said. But no, I appreciate that. I don't know how far down that rabbit hole I have to go, but I'll at least offer that impression. Uh, so but nonetheless, it surprised you that he took some bold economic steps. Say more about the ones particular that surprised you. Was just any particular contents of the Build Back Better bill, for instance, or other legislation that fits in that kind of more progressive than you assumed or predicted frame.
I think a lot of the direct cash to Americans was the thing that was most surprising, like the child tax credit, other the childcare expansion, things like that. Maybe some of the childcare expansion a little less so, but certainly the child tax credit is the exact kind of just give people money policy that progressives have been pushing for a long time, that the kind of centrist Clinton era Democrats were against. And unfortunately, it got tanked by Joe Manchin, who was very much of that mentality. I mean, him running around saying people were going to spend that money on drugs as if like the vast majority of American parents who get this tax credit are drug addicts. I mean, the
No,
wildness
it's the
of it.
kids.
But
They're going to get the child tax credit, give the money to the kids, and then the kids go around back, do their thing. You know how it goes.
that's a sort of logic that Biden used to spend a little bit more time in. And
Yeah,
so I was really impressed by the fact that he came around on
yeah.
the idea that we just need to give people money, that it doesn't need to be means tested, that it doesn't need to be channeled through a bunch of programs, that like just a check in the mail will do a huge amount for people. And I think that that was proved in the past year. I think that we have a lot of evidence that checks in the mail had all these knock-on effects. I don't think that even people expected. Like, I don't think I would have expected the smallness of the checks that people got and the smallness of the unemployment benefits to be so beneficial in terms of helping the labor market improve dramatically.
It it's interesting, isn't it? And this maybe gets to the next question I want to ask you as we look back at the year. So the biggest stories, both that got covered and the biggest stories that maybe got missed or not covered sufficiently. But maybe it shouldn't be as surprising that $1,200 impacts people so much, given reporting over the last number of years on how many people don't have $1,200, how many people can't, make it through missing a paycheck or two and still be able to pay their blank bill. Right, so that just that little bit helped impact a lot of lives. What for you were, in addition to that, or drilling further in on that, what for you were the biggest stories of the year looking back? I don't know if you want to say 20 or maybe your top three.
Well, that's a huge one because I think that the labor market issue is going to have all these compounding effects that were totally unanticipated. Though it would be worth noting that there has been research before in developing countries that a small amount of investment in people, just buying people a cow or just giving them a check, something small, like you said, that in theory doesn't pay all the bills, but can be the cushion that a person needs to invest in their future and allow them to they still have to work, but they now have a little bit extra money that they can pay for a better car or some education or a better home, something that helps them get a better job, right? And I think that we learned that there were a lot more Americans that were, like you said, on the edge of the knife than a lot of people wanted to admit, and that all it took was one check to make this huge difference in their life and allow them to get a better job. So I think that's going to probably have the longest term effects in terms of what historians look back on. Obviously, the pandemic has been this miserable slog that just rules our day in and day out. But history kind of shows that a pandemic like this kind of somewhat gets forgotten a little bit over
Mm-hmm.
time. That I think there will be a lot of interest in the fact that people shut down for so long, that there was so much scientific innovation and everything.
A lot of TikTok
The,
videos.
yeah, the 20, there will be a lot of interesting things that I think some historians will look into because it's like a social phenomenon of the sort that we have never sort of seen before. But I don't know that it's going to end up being as historically important as some of the economic changes that we went through in the past year. So
So
that's the big thing.
let's stick with the labor market. So you say, well, the labor market is a big story. How do you define the labor market? You said, well, it's gotten better, and I think I could put words in your mouth, but probably better for you to do that.
The effects of people's willingness to quit, to seek new work, to ask for more money are so strong that it was the same effect. Many economists that I've read like equate it to like what would happen if you saw a mass unionization event,
Mm-hmm.
but without that, right?
So,
Like,
and if do you have favorite numbers or even favorite anecdotes about the what's been dubbed by others sort of the Great Resignation? I don't know. Maybe you even have a favorite phrase to describe it. This is our chance to write a first and a half draft of history. How, so, do you have a favorite phrase to characterize it and a favorite way to tell that story?
it's so hard to know exactly what happened because like so many people quit for different reasons, right? A lot of the quitters were unfortunately women that still did not have their child care squared away, right? So it wasn't all good. But a lot of it was people in the service industry being like, take this job and shove it. And I think that that has created a upward pressure on wages in that industry that can only be good because as more and more of the American economy becomes service industry oriented, as more and more of those jobs are done by adults, who are it's their career, not just a temporary job. The more we need those jobs to be at least lower middle class, right, instead of poverty wages. So that's the good news. Um, I think the bad news is this might also be the year that is remembered as the one that America basically started to fall to fascism. So that's where my concern is. There's like very good news and then there's horrible news.
Good news is a few baristas got a $2 raise. The bad news is fascism.
I mean, $2 raise is a huge thing
It's
for
a big
barista.
deal. It's a big deal. So
But yeah,
I want to play multiple choice. The Great Resignation, and insert a better phrase if you got one, in terms of the driving reasons. A, aging baby boomers retiring. It's demographics driving destiny. Two, as you said, a lack of childcare and kids at home, schools being shut down. Three, time to reflect, saying, I don't really like what I'm doing. Why don't I do something different? Four, Bitcoin. Look, all I got to do is buy a bunch of tulips and they will infinitely go up in value.
I hope it's not Bitcoin because that's
So A, B, C, D, E, the government gave people money and say, oh, look, I get money for free. I don't have to work.
Well, I don't think people
their,
thought that.
their jobs suck too much, right? So the pay suck too much, benefits suck too much, the working conditions suck too much. G, automation, right, which made certain jobs, whether that could be combined with the others. And I think I'm at H, stress and fear, sort of like emotional trauma, and saying, making things that used to be more palatable, less palatable. And if I'm at H, I'll say I, all or some of the above. Which is it? Or which isn't it?
A lot of the above, but I think stress and fear, I would actually say, is probably going to, I feel, I don't have any evidence, but just kind of like in my own community, I think the idea that stress and fear is driving the resignations as opposed to hope and anticipating an economic upswing is not true, because right now in my neighborhood in Philadelphia, we are just seeing so many businesses open, just so many little mom and pop shops just going up on every corner. And it's what's clear to me is that a lot of people took this pandemic and they saved some money because they weren't going out and doing anything. They took
Mm.
a look around at their job and they said, I don't like this job. Now it's time to start my cupcake bakery. Now it's time to start my dog grooming business. That dream I've always had, I'm going to just do that now. I think this is the year that a lot of people decided that's what they want to do.
So that's the other is not only have a space and time to think, and not only having a little extra money because of government benefits, but also being able to save some costs, not having to spend so much time commuting, not having to spend so much time not being even able to go to basketball games, etc. The year began. Let's do a hard pivot. The year began with an announcement by the Dr. Seuss estate that they were pulling a couple decade-old titles due to the inclusion of illustrations that were culturally insensitive. This led to claims that Dr. Seuss was being or had been canceled. The House Minority Leader posted a video of him reading Green Eggs and Ham in response. The year ended with an election of Glenn Youngkin as the governor of Virginia, who ran on concerns about critical race theory, and analysts saying that played a key factor in the outcome of the governor's race. Where do you think we sit in the state of the kind of cultural and social debate?
Well, it's kind of funny and it's very tempting always to play the hypocrite card, right? Like Trump's 2020 election was complaining that their liberals were doing cancel culture and accusations of censorship. And then that continued with this Dr. Seuss thing, even though no one was actually censoring Dr. Seuss. His estate pulled a few titles that they don't want to be associated with anymore. I don't think that that's the same thing as censorship. Like publishers take stuff out of circulation all the time because it's outdated. What we ended with was a much more classic authoritarian movement where of like actual, like in some cases, demands for book burnings, right? In Virginia, you had the Spotsylvania School Board had members saying that not only did they want to ban books from the library, they wanted to burn them. That didn't happen because once you actually start to push back on this kind of stuff, they tend to recede. No one wants to actually be known as the book burner, but that hasn't, the fact that they're not burning the books hasn't slowed down the fact that like we're seeing this huge movement of censorship, and it is censorship of books written by people of color and queer people almost exclusively, some feminist titles, but it's a pretty strong pattern. It's tempting again to say that they're hypocrites because they were so against cancel culture, whatever that means, at the beginning of the year. But the fact of the matter is, it's of a piece, right? There's a one narrative that's driving the right, which is that they are being oppressed by quote unquote woke culture that's taking away their culture. And the only way to fight back is to play the victim and then censor anything they see as threateningly woke.
Have you had any insight? Have you covered anything or had any thoughts about the most intelligent responses to that? Right. So we had a Mr. Rothschild, no relation to the banking family, on previously. We had another author on talking specifically about critical race theory, and given the outcome of the Virginia governor's race, it's safe to assume that critical race theory, however people might define or misdefine it, however important or unimportant it might be, will be a key issue in 2022 midterm elections, congressional elections. Will end up in ads because it seemed to be effective in helping to win races. Do you think that that progressive activists and or Democratic elected officials and or the media at large were caught flat-footed with respect to critical race theory? Do you think it taps into something that's important? Any way to sort of characterize that can help people understand it and or respond?
I mean, the Democrats were clearly caught flat-footed. Terry McAuliffe's campaign didn't start highlighting the fact that the books that the right was trying to censor were classics like Beloved by Toni Morrison until the last couple weeks of the race. If they had immediately hit back by saying you're book burners, I think they would have won that particular debate. But instead, they decided to avoid it. I
I want
recognize.
to pause on that because you sort of said it second two times, but it took me until the second time to get it, and and it's the most effective thing I've heard. It's the most intuitively the thing that resonates the most in terms of the effective thing I've heard so far is that if somebody comes out and says critical race theory, you say, well, what are you trying to do? If what you're trying to do is ban blank, then you're a book burner, then you're a book banner. And that is very different than, and even cuts against this claim of trying to stop people from being canceled.
Exactly. And like,
That's helpful.
that's the reason they initially went with the cancel culture narrative, right? Because there's this narrative in American society, thankfully, that free speech is good, that free
Yeah.
discourse is good, that people should be able to engage difficult thoughts and difficult questions, right? But that's not where the right ever is or wants to be. That's not their, that was always a troll, that was always a pose. Um, they've handed a loaded gun to the left, and it's just a matter of firing it right on top in this case because they're trying to ban books. No one wants to be the book banner, and I think that this could be a winning issue for Democrats. They just have to be willing to fight it, and there's a lot of trepidation around it because again, it touches on race, which is always a very difficult subject. They use this term critical race theory. They use it incorrectly. But the reason that Christopher Rufo, who kind of he's a think tank guy, a right-wing think tank guy who started this entire hysteria. The reason he seized on that term is because he knows that it provokes both a lot of racist resentment, but also I would call an intellectual defensiveness,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of parents, unfortunately, that are very open to being stirred up by fears that their kids are going to be brighter, more intellectually ambitious and whatnot than they are.
No, campaigning against the intellectual elite has been a move of people trying to stop good policy for a long time. Right? Don't argue on the policy. Try to say anybody promoting a good idea is a pointy-headed weirdo that can't be trusted.
Yeah, but again, the easy way to push back against that is to just say freedom of speech, freedom of discourse. No one really actually wants to say education is a bad thing, so make them say it.
I want to keep moving through big stories of the year. This past summer, you wrote a piece in Salon. I think the title was Census Data or Data, depending on how you pronounced it when you wrote it, reveals the real reason why the Republican Party is ramping up its war on democracy. Explain more about that. What about the census data reveals the reason why Republicans are ramping up that war, to use your term?
This is like a thing that the left has been ignoring for a long time because it's very uncomfortable. But if you actually read like right-wing blogs and right-wing articles, you can see that this has been anxiety for at least 20 years. If you follow some of the conferences that the religious right has been having, especially internationally, there's a lot of talk about demographic shifts, and there's a lot of talk about they use a lot, it's coded but very barely, like fears that white people are getting wedged out of power in their countries, right? So like World Congress of Families and groups like that will have, and they tie it to anti-reproductive rights language and things like that. So this has been going on a long time, and I think it's been kind of ignored by Democrats and liberals because it's so weird and so uncomfortable and it's so hard to talk about. But now it's on Fox News every night. You have Tucker Carlson raving about the Great Replacement theory, which is a neo-Nazi theory that white people are going to be replaced with people of color. And in the neo-Nazi way of telling it, they think that there's a Jewish conspiracy to import people of color to replace white people, white Christians, so that are, and these people of color are supposedly easier to control. That's the gross theory. Tucker drops the word Jew out of it, but it's still basically the same idea.
No, he inserts liberal. He inserts.
Yeah.
It's been the move for a while, and I put, although it was more specific both geographically and sort of nationalistically and racially. But back to 1994, Pete Wilson, Proposition 187. I mean, I remember all the articles that were swirling in California in the late 80s and early 90s about the demographic shifts in California, the impact that was having, the psychological and political impact that was having on a lot of Republican and beyond white Californians, people who had elected Ronald Reagan to be governor, and then many who voted for him for president, and then Pete Wilson puts on the ballot an initiative to try to ratchet down on that, and that. So to me, it's been on my radar screen for, I don't know, what is that, 27 years, 26 years, but where do you put? One could say it started with John Birch Society, right? Maybe it goes way beyond that, but if you were going to identify benchmarks or starter pistols on that, where would you put them?
Well, if you want to go back that far, it goes to the hysteria around this started in the 60s when LBJ changed immigration law. So in the 1920s, there was a similar fascistic, racist hysteria in the country where white people were afraid of immigrants, and then it was Italians and Germans and to an extent Irish still. Eastern Europeans and Jews were kind of the targeted groups. And they passed these laws that restricted immigration from certain countries, but they specifically restricted a huge amount of immigration from Asia and Africa. And in the 1960s, LBJ changed that. He passed a law that did not have racialized quotas on immigration anymore. And so groups like FAIR, which Donald Trump relied on really heavily for his immigration policy ideas, started back then, and they were in direct response to, if you look at it, after LBJ changed that law, like, we had a huge influx of immigrants from China, India, Africa, places like that. It's been to
because prior there was a quota. Prior there was a certain number of people from China who could come, a certain number of people from Africa, and then he said, and he relaxed that.
Yeah, and it's been to the benefit of our society, absolutely. But obviously, racists don't like it. They haven't liked it for a long time. I think that it's been a kind of narrow concern with white supremacist groups for most of that history. But you're right, like in California, and I'm from Texas, so I can say it was true in Texas too. They were kind of early indicators of those kind of anxieties going mainstream in the conservative movement, because it was a direct reaction to states like California and Texas that went minority majority first, right? Where white people stopped being the absolute majority. They might still be the plurality of people, but when you look at, there's no single group that is the 50+% of the population in those states. And now the whole country is headed in that direction. So that anxiety is metastasizing.
What is the state of immigration now, right? I am not up on the data. There were reports of immigration declining during the Trump administration. A 2020 report by Vox and the Center for Public Integrity showed the Trump administration was using policies to suppress the count, and that may just be for voting purposes, but also makes me wonder if that impacts our awareness, our information relative to immigration. What do we know about immigration rates to 2016 to 2020, and what do we know about any shift since Joe Biden has become president? And I say it in part because it's related to the labor market. There's a challenging thing to talk about in a lot of ways, also because you have lots of labor theorists who are like, wait a minute, if you want to jack up wages, then you don't want, you want to be careful about a bunch of competition in the labor market, particularly competition in the labor market that might be lower cost. And so it ends up getting really tangled. But then if you say it, then you end up sounding like a racist, right? So strange bedfellows and strange language. But sticking to the facts or attempting to, what do we know about immigration rates? And to be clear, let me just say this other thing while you ruminated on that question. It seems to me one of the necessary, and I'd like to see better economic arguments made more loudly. Like one of the essence, it's not just that we have a statue in New York. One of the great advantages of the United States is we have tended not to have labor shortages because we've had lots of people, skilled and becoming skilled workers, right? Unskilled and very skilled workers. And so so even when we've had downturns in birth rates, we've still had a bunch of workers, and that's kept the economy resilient. So now, as we see baby boomers retiring, my generation, not wanting to age anybody, but maybe our generation, smaller than the baby boomer generation, that will still need people to do stuff. We won't want everybody to be retired. So I'll just say that sort of that economic editorial comment, but then ask, what do we know about immigration rates right now and trends?
They're low. You're right that the Trump administration definitely tried to distort numbers in many ways. But just today, the 2020 census information from 2020 came out and found that we had the slowest population growth in the history of the country ever last year. And part of that was that there was probably an extra million deaths from COVID and knock-on effects, right? Also, people are not having children, which can you blame them? And then a lot of people didn't immigrate. They were not allowed to because of pandemic restrictions. They don't want to because the United States used to be this great beacon of hope around the world, and now it's starting to look less so. I don't know if immigration is going to get better, if we're going to see more people wanting to come in. I think we have to wait a couple of years to see after the pandemic and how much effect that had in just people willing to move from one place to another at all. If that's going to change, or if people are just deciding the United States is not a place that they want to live, which if it's true, which I suspect it might be on some level, is a very sad thing for this country. I agree that it can be a little complicated on the labor market issue, but I think that the reality is that immigrants tend to take a lot of jobs that where there's labor shortages, period. So they don't actually drive down wages as much as some people say. And more importantly, they bring money into the economy. They're younger than the average native-born American. They pay taxes. They contribute to our overall GDP. They have children that we need to drive down our aging population's agingness. I think that, and of course, I grew, like I said, I grew up in Texas. I specifically grew up in El Paso on the border, and I can say that living in a bilingual, bicultural community was a really great benefit to me personally. And I think that it really was a reminder that one of the things that makes this country great, we have so much innovation, we have so much change, we have so much progress and open thought, and innovation is because we bring in so many people and different perspectives.
No, the last big vacation I took for the pandemic, I went to Spain with my wife, and what I hadn't known, because I'm an insufficient student of history, was that you can track Spain's rise and fall as a global power. Now, to be clear, global power in that era was not all, as it is not now, but even more so, was not all sunshines and rainbows. Typically, it meant taking ships and going and taking over lands that were occupied by brown people, right? So, but nonetheless, Spain was a global power, artistically, economically, militarily, etc. And you can track its decline with the ratcheting up of anti-Semitic activity with the Spanish Inquisition. And once Spain became a place that was no longer welcoming to Jewish and Muslim people as it had been, you go to Spain, like Spanish style architecture and Spanish style tiles are that way because of their adjacency to the Muslim world. And as soon as there was a Christian ratcheting down or even extermination of Muslim and Jewish people, it coincided very closely with Spain's decline as a global power because they got dumber and they got more scared and they got less able to bring in people who could solve problems that the existing people there weren't already solving. And I will say I'm a patriot. Right. I am now occasionally an apologetic one, but mostly unapologetically, or I will say unapologetically, but with significant explanation and caveat. But I'm a patriot. OK. And I've been thinking about it. If I just put my patriot hat on, right, my pro-democracy patriot. Right. Not like for an American fascist state. Right. Not like, oh, if we go out and murder a bunch of people, as long as it has the flag that I grew up with, I'm down with it. But I'm a pro-democracy patriot.
A patriot, not a nationalist.
Yeah. If I wanted to destroy the United States, right, I know that like a land war ain't going to do it. I know a nuclear war probably not going to do it, and it's certainly not going to help me if I'm actually trying to get anything out of destroying the United States. What would I do? I think some of the things I would do is divide us terribly. I think one of the things I would do is weaken our reputation around the world so that our goods were harder to sell and fewer people wanted to be here and work with us. I think I would try to break down our international alliances. It'd be easier for me if I wanted to be a leader of China, say, or Russia, say, and I wanted to threaten the invasion of a neighboring state. And the big thing I was always scared of was not just the United States, but the United States and global allies enacting military or just economic sanctions upon me. That if I could make the United States less able to be the cool kid in school and bring everybody together, that I might be more able to do those sort of things. I'd want to remove the dollar as the global reserve currency, right? I might want to have some weird currency instead that people use to make it harder to navigate or regulate any of that. I might want to block immigration, reduce the United States access to labor, talent, and energy to make us dumber and weaker and fewer. These are some of the things I might do. And I look at that list and it seems far too explanatory of stuff that I see people trying to do over the last several years.
I mean, you don't have to be hypothetical about a lot of those tactics. I mean, Vladimir Putin does not hide that he is government. He does not really hide. He'll deny it if you stick a mic in his face, but he enjoys like trolling people with like obvious lies, right? But he has funded a massive disinformation campaign aimed not just to the United States, but around the world with a lot of those goals in mind, right? So racism, so division, so paranoia about things like we have evidence that Russia did disinfo around Brexit and helped push the vote in that direction. So it's not just the US that's targeted by campaigns like this. I don't know that.
No, they wanted to break up Europe too, right? If I wanted to do it, what I'd really be looking at is if I were playing global politics and I was on the wrong side, and I will say now that I will, say that I have a side, and my side is for democracy, and that's my side, okay? And what I would try to do is I would try to break down the post-World War II sort of United States plus Western European, I can't call it consensus, but at least that sort of confabulation. And Brexit would be one move in that direction. One move in that direction.
And I think I don't want to put everything on Russia. They're pushing on an open door. I think that a lot of these things are not a conspiracy. We're just looking at a temper tantrum around the world of rising authoritarianism. Because you look at countries like India and Brazil, and they're having similar problems to the United States, where there's just this huge reactionary element that has reacted to growing democracy, growing freedom, growing like cultural exchange by panicking, becoming nationalist, becoming much more protective of racial hierarchies inside their countries, right? So we're not alone. But you're absolutely right that that's exactly what's happening somewhat naturally is being accelerated by people who very specifically see it in their interest to to accelerate these kinds of problems because nothing is more dangerous. Nothing is more dangerous to autocracy than people themselves deciding that they care about democracy and they're going to defend it. I think one of the most important things to remember about Vladimir Putin, one of the most important stories I've ever heard about him is that he obsessively watches the video of Gaddafi getting killed.
Interesting.
Because he knows on some level that he's a paper tiger. And if people just started to see him for what he was, it could be over in a day.
I want to let that sit for a moment. I don't have a great response. I just do want to let that sit. We'll edit out my pause. We'll edit out certainly these wasted words, but I appreciate what you had to say, and it's kind of scary. All right. So Biden's big three, hard pivot. So and I think Biden probably sees his role as a man of some years greater than 50 as I don't know how many, but it's more than 50, as trying to say, and I think there are people who speak to him directly. It's like, listen, we got to save this Western project. We got to save this pro-democracy project. When they said that the end of history is upon us, it's like, well, either we want to root for the end of history or at least don't want it to move towards an authoritarian direction. Like, I think actually Biden's bought into that. And he came in and said, okay, I think we got three big things I want to do. There's a bunch of stuff, but three big things. And I can do it because I was in the Senate for a long time, and I'll make a couple of Republican friends, and I'll be able to get Joe Manchin to come along, and didn't see Kirsten Sinema coming. I think none of us who knew her years ago saw her coming this way. And we will get three big things done. We'll get infrastructure done. We'll get a big social policy package done. We'll get a big voting rights package done. I was Elizabeth Warren's supporter. She probably won my vote when she was a well thought of professor at my law school, and dear friends of mine respect her. Would a variety of political stripes would jump in front of a train for her. But also when she was asked, what's the thing you would do first? And she said, without a beat of pause, democracy first, voting rights first, because but for that, we can't do anything else. And that demonstrated to me not only an overlap of values and ideology, but an overlap of strategy and strategic sensibility. I still think that was and is kind of the only chance. Right now, on those big three, Biden got one done. He got the one done that was the least threatening to the folks who really don't like the other two. What's the status of those two things? Are they both dented in a doornail? Is there any hope for a major social policy package? Any hope for parents who are hoping for support for their children and people hoping to be able to make it to a voting center without getting blocked or eliminated from the voting rolls for no good reason? What do we know, and/or what do you predict?
I think Build Back Better is dead. I've thought that for months now. I've been skeptical of it passing since they split it into two bills, right?
As soon as they took infrastructure separated from the social policy piece, as soon as Joe Manchin could vote on just the infrastructure part and not have to do and be able to vote no, allow him to vote no on climate change and no on any taxes that help poor people, that made it easy.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Warren was saying on the campaign trail, which is that you have to have democracy first, because other than that, special interests and the wealthy have too much power. And we're seeing exactly what she said would happen, which is the strong majorities of Americans vote for Democrats. And they vote for Democrats under the belief that Democrats are going to pass or going to want to pass aggressive economic policies of a progressive stripe, that they're going to want to do something on climate change, that people want these things. The polling data shows over and over and over again that people want these things. They can't have them because we don't have a democracy. People vote till they're blue in the face, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter. I mean, obviously Trump is gone. That was a huge win, but it took 8 million more votes. And he almost won anyway.
Yeah.
Like, we have I think the in the congressional election, like Democrats had like something like 5 or 6 million more votes. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a not small amount. And yet they barely hang on to Congress. They lost seats in 2020 in the House. So you can't pass bills that the people want unless the people get to pick their leaders.
Yeah.
And we are not in a situation right now. Like, we didn't vote for Joe Manchin. Like, but yet he is still
But
more
thousands of West
anybody.
Virginians did. Thousands and thousands of West Virginians.
Yeah, but I mean, they're a small state.
Yeah, but thousands of them must have voted for him.
Yeah, they did. But
I mean,
it's
more,
ridiculous
not as
that
many as millions, right? Not as many as, are people in the country.
it's ridiculous that Montana has 2 senators and a population that's, I think, a tenth the size of the city of New York. I mean, New York doesn't have 2 senators. New York City has 0 senators. Their state has 2 senators. It's a real problem, and obviously
Joe Manchin got 290,000 votes. He got 290,000 votes. I mean, that's almost as many people as live in Portland, Oregon.
exactly like they did not write the people. Part of the problem is this country has this like worship of the Constitution, whereas the people who wrote the Constitution said you guys should rewrite this every 10 years, and then we just didn't, and here we are. Like, it was written for a rural country and it doesn't fit an urban country. That's a deeper problem than even Warren's reforms that she proposed would have addressed. But her kind of idea of, like, at least let everyone vote, at least, get lobbyists out of DC, at least pull some of the levers that are causing the people to not be represented in their government out of the equation, and then maybe we'll get closer to real reform. But I mean, the proof is in the pudding. We did not. The fact that we don't have a representative government is why we can't pass these big social spending bills. And it's just not vice versa. Like, even if you pass those big social spending bills, it doesn't matter if people can't reward you at the ballot box for doing so.
So to be clear, Eric Adams didn't quite get 3 times mayoral candidate, now mayor of New York City. He didn't quite get 3 times as many votes as Joe Manchin. He didn't quite get 3 times as many. Almost exactly 3 times, but not quite 3 times. He got 753,000 votes, and that's more than Joe Manchin, but I don't think it's quite 3 times. Not even close. Joe Manchin got 290,000 votes. That's thousands and thousands of votes deciding policy for the entire country. So let's get to democracy. You say that Build Back Better you thought was dead months ago, and I have been skeptical. And the reason I've been skeptical is it hasn't been clear to me why Joe Manchin would want to vote for it. And then it became not clear to me why Kyrsten Sinema would want to vote for it, unless there was something they really wanted. And it wasn't clear what they really wanted. It didn't seem like they thought it was bad news to be the people who stopped it, right? They seem to kind of revel in that status. So I have also been skeptical, but I still sort of assumed that everybody was working on it so much that there was some sort of deal that could be reached. That there was some sort of, but when Joe Manchin didn't come out and say, "Hey, here's the things I'm down for. Let's just pass these." And when he never did that, I was like, "Oh, that's not what a yes vote does, right? That's not what a maybe vote does. That's just to sit back and wait." But let's assume you're right. There's no new life to be breathed into something. Joe Manchin doesn't want to show policy leadership. He only wants to show policy blocking. On democracy stuff, Joe Manchin started out as a supporter prior. In fact, I think he might have been a co-sponsor of HR 1, or at least announced his support for it years ago. More recently, I think he's opposed to it. You got the same view about major democracy reforms. Those are dead, and therefore Republicans will pick up big majorities in both chambers in 2022?
I really wish I had a different answer.
Yeah.
But yeah, obviously it's dead. I think that if it had been the priority instead of infrastructure and social spending, there was a chance.
Maybe a chance. Would have been hard, though.
A really
still.
low one. Because they did try, they brought it to the floor multiple times
Yeah.
and tried to get a vote on it, and Republicans blocked it because Manchin won't and Cinema won't sign on to filibuster reform. But like, it's a really unfortunate thing that the problem we're seeing in the United States right now, something that scholars of democracy have been pointing out for years now, which is that once a democracy starts dying, it's very hard to revive it. The authoritarianism builds on itself. The anti-democracy party gets power and they make the country less democratic, and that just kind of has a snowball effect. And we're seeing it now, like, because we couldn't get a voting rights bill past the filibuster, which is an anti-democratic institution. Now the elections are going to be less free and fair, and Republicans will get more power and will pass more laws to make it harder to vote, et cetera, et cetera.
It's an anti-democracy spiral, and the pro-democracy folks have to not be emotionally down. They have to not feel defeated, or that the die has already been cast, because some energy has to move the spiral upwards. Because you can have a pro-democracy spiral, right? You can grant democracy, and that can grant more democracy. That can even happen at the local and state level. So don't want anybody to feel bummer, but I feel the bummer.
We have the people on our side. We have the numbers. So it's not hopeless.
Big majorities want democracy to work and think it's a real thing and should be a real thing. But just before we wrap, let's finish this discussion with the way the last presidency ended, with an attempted insurrection. How do you think about that now? How do you think about the efforts at, or lack of efforts at, or lack of completion of holding people accountable? How do you connect the 2020 census results perhaps and that insurrection and how we started the show? Offer some thoughts on that to close us out.
I think that the people who pointed out it was a white supremacist riot are the ones that have the most accurate read of the situation, which is that, like many other race riots in this country, like Tulsa, et cetera, it was about a bunch of white people freaking out at the possibility that white power was going to be threatened in any way. And Trump managed to channel that fear towards his own, his own power-hungry goals. But that was why they were there, and he's just a conduit. I would say that the problem right now is that as much as that scared and alarmed everyone, they're winning. Trump managed to convince the Republican Party that it's in their interest, and he probably has a point, that to continue the project he started of trying to undermine democracy. And while a lot of them didn't necessarily enjoy the riot, they have nonetheless been defending it. They have a lot of power politically, and it disappoints me that Joe Biden and Merrick Garland aren't pulling the one lever that they have to stop this from happening in 2024, which is to arrest the ringleaders. You can break the back of a fascist conspiracy by breaking its back. Like, you can just do that directly. I don't know why they're afraid of doing that. As far as I know, sedition continues to be a crime, and conspiracy and election interference, and I'm a little confused. It's not going to solve all our problems. We still have a large anti-democracy movement that controls state houses across the country, and that's our bigger problem. But, without their leaders, without the people organizing to steal elections, it would at least be slowed down. Just buy us some time. Come on.
Amanda Marcotte, senior politics writer at Salon.com. Thank you so much for talking to us. Hope we have a chance to do it again. And thank you for being a democracy nerd.
Thank you for having me.
Be well.